Okay, testing. Now it's working. Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to this wild ecology seminar. Yeah, and I'm happy to share a couple of projects I've been working on as a postdoctoral fellow. Well, basically, I will discuss or summarize some of the aspects of main results of these projects, trying to understand how fire affects grasslands productivity and diversity in general. So yeah, as Anna well said about my background, so yes, I'm a plant community ecologist, and for the last couple of years, I've been working as a postdoctoral fellow here at the Department of Plant Sciences in a couple of interesting projects and how disturbances affect grasslands in general way, particularly fire and grazing. So those two key disturbances in grasslands, and hopefully some of the results will be of interest for you as well. So let's jump into it right away. So fire. So when one of the first things that comes to mind about fire is that it's dangerous, right? And indeed, it's dangerous. I mean, it can, under uncontrolled conditions, it can kill animals, it can devastate vegetation in general, landscapes in general, and also injure people or kill people in some cases. So it's really dangerous. So that's why, for those reasons, it's important to understand how fire works under different ecosystems, particularly grassland ecosystems in the case I'm working on right now. And so in order to learn how that works and to try to control that fires, understanding the ecological role in prairie ecosystems. So let's start with what exactly is fire. So fire is basically, in layman terms, is a chemical reaction and represents basically by three different elements: oxygen, heat, and fuel. So when these three different elements come together and reach a certain point, fire starts. And as long as these three elements start maintaining that threshold point, fire keeps going for a certain period of time. And that's how it works. So when we're talking about fuel, in general terms, in prairie ecosystems, fuel is vegetation in general. So that's what is born here. And now, geographically speaking, fire across Canada is widely distributed. As we can see here in this map, according with the Canadian National Fire Database, there are more than 8,000 fires per year, which is really high, affecting more than 2 million hectares across Canada. And interestingly, lightning is the main cause, probably why these fires are happening around 50%. And those fires affect around 85% of the annual area burned in Canada. So which is really interesting. And you can see here in this map that most of those fires that are represented here in red dots are fires that happened between 1980 and 2020. And you can see that they are mostly located in boreal forest. And just a very few points here in this blank area, that represents the prairie ecosystem in Canada, in the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and a little bit of the corner in Manitoba as well. So, but that doesn't mean that fire is not representative or a really big issue in this ecosystem. In fact, under certain uncontrolled conditions can be a really devastating activity. For example, the fire that happened in the fall in 2017. So this fire happened in the province of Alberta, in the corner, in southeast corner of Alberta. And I don't know what exactly happened there, but probably it was a lightning, most likely, that start or ignite this fire. And yeah, and born across the border of Saskatchewan, affecting more than 28,000 hectares, including 8,000 hectares of pasture, and killing around 700 animals. And I believe there was one firefighter that also was killed in this fire. So it's a pretty big issue here. in economical terms, is quite important as well. So this is a pretty good example of how this triangle of the fire concept works well, really well when under those environmental conditions, and especially when wind is quite favorable, because at this fire, it happens under around 100 kilometers per hour. So that was really devastating activity here. Anyway, going back to the distribution of fires across Canada, we can see here that most of those fires are located in the boreal forest, as I said before. So this map also represents fires that happened between 1980 and 2020. And there are just a very few points in the prairie ecosystems here, which is telling me two things here. The first is that probably the data that is included in these databases in Canada is not including fires that happen in prairie ecosystems. Or also, in the worst case scenario, is telling me that fires is still being suppressed. And that's a pretty big issue. I'm saying that because fire interact with grasslands and animals as well. So the way that these prairies in North America were created, basically by interacting with fire and herbivores, especially. So it's a really important ecological value to maintain grasslands ecosystem. Now, these grasslands are very well adapted to these disturbances, particularly because plants are adapted to fire here. So most of the biomass of plants are located underground. So everything that is burned is basically what is located above ground. So they can easily regrow. So they are well adapted to this type of disturbances. And also, the interaction with animals is often positive. So animals respond positively very often to fire. So that's why this interaction is very important to maintain in order to keep other ecosystem services that must be beneficial for humans as well. Yeah, so that's why reintroducing fire in grasslands is very important. And several agencies now in Saskatoon area and other areas in Canada are working very hard to reintroduce a fire in a very safety way. So that's how this organization called the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange was created. And the reason behind this is because we have several organizations here, agencies, that work very hard to reintroduce fire in grasslands for different purposes. But some of them may not have enough equipment to do it. Others may have the skills, but they don't have the equipment as well. So that's why they created this Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange in order to basically share conducting fires. So to share equipment, to collaborate between personnel to conduct fires in a safety way. And most importantly, one of the objectives of this Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange is to train people. So to train between each other of these agencies, and also to educate the general public into what fire is and why is it important. And of course, sharing fire science. So this is an example of one of the prescribed fires that I was able to participate. And this prescribed fire was happening in the Northeast Swale last year. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it happened in November 2021, so last year, in the fall. And you can see that there are people here from different agencies and how well controlled is fire. So that's one of the examples of the prescribed fire that we are working and reintroducing into grasslands. And here is the result of that. So this picture was taken in May 2022, so this spring. So you can see how fire affected the area that was burned last year. Kind of reactivate the vegetation, and you can clearly see the color here is different from the areas that wasn't affected by the fire. So you kind of have a visual impact of what fire can be causing into these prairies. And that's a perfect example of how this collaboration works between different agencies. Another objective of the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange, as I said, was training. So that's why it was recently introduced this course called Introduction to Prescribed Fire in Grasslands Ecosystems. And that is in collaboration with the University of Saskatchewan. So everybody can have access to that. Students, professors, general public, so they can just register. I think it has a fee. I don't know exactly what's the fee for that course, but everybody interested into that, into learn what prescribed fire is and why is it important, can register and learn about it. And I put also a couple of pictures of the last training sessions we have in this October in order to improve our skills in conducting these prescribed fires. So you can have now an idea of what we are doing right now in trying to reintroduce prescribed fires on grasslands ecosystems and why is that important. But as an academic, we are trying to look for the scientific point of view in order to give support on developing these prescribed fires from a scientific point of view. So that's why we are working in a couple of projects. I'm gonna present today a couple of projects that I work on the last 2 years, trying to understand how grassland responds to fire in terms of forest quality, and also how fire impact grasslands in terms of productivity and diversity. So let's start with the first one here. So this project was a collaboration between the University of Saskatchewan and the University of Alberta. And basically, we are trying to evaluate the interaction between those two disturbances, grazing and fire. And we know that fire is a generalized removal of biomass. So everything is born, everything is taken out of the land. And also, we have this disturbance, grazing, which is a more selective disturbance with a species level impact, right? So cattle and other animals can select certain plants from the ground. So that's why it's a selective disturbance. And we also know that fire and grazing, we think that they are quite linked through forest quality. And the reason behind this is because when fire happens, new vegetation regrowth after that. And that vegetation is quite nutritious, quite palatable. And that's why it's highly attractive to animals, particularly large ungulates such as bison and cattle. So they are attracted to these areas, so they go back and eat that vegetation. So that's how this pyric herbivore cycle is closed. And it happens every time after these fires are happening in these areas. So we're trying to understand to what extent fire affects forage quality in this after these fires happen, basically. In doing so, we selected this area of one of the fires that happened in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and we analyzed the protein values on the vegetation in different plant groups. And we used the fire that happened in October 2017. So there were actually 2 fires that happened here, and you can see that black area were 2 big fires, and you can even see the direction of the wind at that moment. Yeah, so we established several transects there, 12 different transects across the wildfires, trying to identify born versus unborn sites and grazing versus ungrazing. And we sampled every single summer for 4 consecutive years after the fire. And we analyzed grasses and forbs for crude protein and fiber, specifically neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber. So this is an example of one of the exclosures we use. And these exclosures, 12 of them were located in the edges of those fires. So trying to identify and analyze born areas and unborn areas. And disclosure, of course, you know, that kind of avoid animals to affect the vegetation inside. And you can clearly see the effect of grazing compared to the outside, right? And these are transects that were located outside those exclosures to evaluate the interaction with fire and grazing. And you can see here the team ready to start the evaluation. So in every transect, we collected samples by clipping grasses, forbs, shrubs separately. So we could analyze different plant groups as well. Yeah, and in general, or in total, we collected more than 1,200 samples, and we calculated the protein content of those mixed species samples by near infrared spectroscopy. So that is a technique that we selected because it's cheaper, basically. So it's less expensive than traditional laboratory techniques. The challenge here is that we use partialist square regression. So if we need that technique, that statistical technique, the problem was that it was giving us regression coefficients below 70%. And that is pretty low. In order to have a very accurate model, we need more than 80 or 90% of accuracy to be valid. And we also were having negative predicted values. So that's a pretty big issue. So we needed to switch to an additional or new methodology. In this case, we use generalized partialist square regressions to predict the protein content in the vegetation. And what we essentially were doing here is we're giving more flexibility to the models to have a better fit for the data that we collected. And we were actually having better coefficient regressions between 85 and 91%, and 0 negative predicted value. So you can see here in this figure, this is the calibration of the model, and this is the validation. So both models fit perfectly. I'm not going to go deep into this methodology because a lot of statistical mathematical equations behind this. But if someone is interested, I can be happy to talk about after the conference or the talk. Anyway, yeah, let's go back to the effect of fire on forest quality. And indeed, what we found is that fire affects a proportion of crude protein in the vegetation. So in this figure, we can see that this is the y-axis representing the crude protein in percentage, and the x-axis represents burned areas in the red box, and the unburned areas in the green boxes by every single year. So we have 2018 and 2019. So 2 years, 2 growing seasons after the fire that happened in that area. And we can clearly see that in these 2 years, we have a significant differences in crude protein between those 2 areas. So protein levels are higher in areas that were affected by the fire, while areas that weren't affected by the fire have lower protein content. However, starting the 3rd year after that fire, it looks like there is no significant difference. So telling us that the protein values are returning to the pre-fire conditions in these areas. So fire seems to be affecting forest quality in these areas only 2 years after fire happens, or at least in this area is happening that way. Another interesting aspect that we found here is that in terms of fiber content, fire seems to reduce the amount of fiber in the vegetation. And that is telling us that the digestibility of the vegetation is improved. And most likely, that's why animals are so attracted to these areas, because the palatability of the vegetation is improved. Interestingly here, there were no grazing effects. So cattle didn't produce any effect in forest quality. And the reason behind this probably is because we were having low stocking rates. So ranchers here were probably cautious of using a big density of animals in these areas in order to not produce a lot of effect on the vegetation. So we're having very low numbers of animals, and we ended up without having any effect on forest quality. So we only found that fire affects forest quality, but not grazing. And we also didn't find any fire effect on different plant groups. So forbs or grasses weren't directly affected by fire, but we did find that forbs represented in these red boxes contain higher protein content than grasses in the green boxes. And that happens every single year after the wildfire. And the most interesting part here is that if you look in this year, 2020 and 2021, if you remember those years, those 2 years were particularly dry. They were severely dry. And it looks like forbs seems to maintain that amount of quality. So seems to have a similar amount of crude protein, even though they are facing those severe environmental conditions. So thinking about for rangeland purposes, if we introduce forbs into pastures, might be a good option to buffer the effect of severe environmental conditions when grasses are no longer present because of the environmental conditions here. Now, there was an indirect effect of fire on nutrients in forbs and grasses. And this is a three-dimensional figure that basically compare crude protein, litter or dead standing biomass, and between forbs and grasses here. And we can see here that there is a negative relationship between protein and litter. So we can see here for grasses and forbs, it's kind of a negative trend in both aspects. And the thing that something is happening here is that when fire removes litter, as we can see here in this negative value, when there is no litter in the ground, the protein content in grasses and forbs increases. But when fire couldn't remove any amount of litter from the ground, the protein levels is reduced. So that means that there is an indirect effect of fire on grasses and forbs in protein content by removing litter from the ground. And what I'm saying here is that fire changed the relationship, the strength of the relationship between protein and litter. And you can see here in this figure, those red dots represent unburned areas, and the black dots represent burned areas. So the unburned areas, they have certain amount of protein content, but that trend seems to be steady, like very similar amount of protein, regardless the amount of litter on the ground. But when fire happens, that relationship changes to a negative trend. So that's why it's also indicating that fire intensity differed across the landscape. So not all the area was completely removed by the fire, but some areas were. Anyway, just to summarize this part, what is the role of fire in terms of forest quality? So the main message here is that fire increases crude protein for the next 2 years after the fire happens. And those protein values return to the pre-fire conditions starting the 3rd year. And a key message here is that forbs may provide a buffer effect on protein content under severe environmental conditions, especially dry. Yeah, so that's the first part of my talk. And now let's jump into another project I've been working on right now, trying to evaluate the impact of fire on grasslands productivity and diversity. And this project is a collaboration between the University of Saskatchewan with the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange, and it's funded by the Weston Family Foundation and MITAX. And in this project, what we are trying to do here is to produce a research database. And that research database, what we're planning to do is to include into the website of the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange. So everybody will be able to extract this information. So what we're doing here is, what we're going to use this database is to try to understand how fire affects productivity and diversity in order to support decisions on the use of fire as a management tool in the prairie. So all of the agencies that are working with prescribed fires right now, they can use this information for their own purposes. So we know already that grasslands that are being affected by prescribed fires, they have some benefits. For example, habitat restoration. So when we conduct some prescribed fires, we can improve the habitat quality of the area. We can also increase plant animal diversity. Sometimes when areas are dominated by invasive species, we can put some fire on that, reduce that amount of dominance of those invasive species, and so that helps native species to regrow. And also we know already that fire can reduce litter accumulation. And by reducing litter accumulation, we are also reducing the risk of wildfires to happen. So that's some of the benefits of the prescribed fires. And there are several individual studies that support those ideas. or those benefits of the prescribed fire. However, there are no quantitative reviews or systematic analysis on those individual studies. And that is critical because we need to understand the effect of fire at larger scales. That helps us to justify the use of prescribed fires, anticipate those fire effects at small or large scale, so we can predict what could happen after we conduct some prescribed fires, and also determine the appropriate time intervals between fires. So we can use that information for that. So that's why we are working in this meta-analysis project with the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange. And we are selecting relevant bibliography on grassland fire research and extracting data from those individual studies. And together, we're putting together this grassland fire research database. So essentially, what we're doing here is to put some keywords on searching tools such as Web of Science and Google Scholar. And so far, we found that in Web of Science, we have around 9,000 different studies, and in Google Scholar, around 6,000. You may know that's a lot of work, but we believe it's really important for our goals. And so how it's going to look like our research database. So this is the website of the Canadian Prairies Prescribed Fire Exchange. So we're going to introduce our research, our different selected bibliography into that website. So we're going to post those selected research studies. Every single study will contain their metadata. So where was that study conducted? What was that about? The location and latitude, longitude, etc. So all of those aspects will be collected and input into this website. And also, we're going to provide plot level data for every single individual study. So it's a lot of work, but we believe that's going to be useful for different user levels. So for people interested into using plot level data, they may collect this data and make further analysis, or people who are probably interested in just certain studies or a particular location, they can just go to the selected bibliography and just extract those papers that are of interest of them. But in general, this summarizes what the research database is. So here you can see in this map the location of the studies that we have extracted so far. Those black points represent every single study that we have extracted already. And most of them are located in North America. So there are some points in South America, Africa, a couple of in Europe, and some other places. And this map also shows the variation in precipitation levels. And this map shows the variation in mean annual temperature. So these are some of the questions that we can start answering on how grasslands responds to fire by analyzing the correlation with weather parameters. Like, for example, what would be the response of plant diversity to fire in grasslands? So it seems so far, and this is a preliminary result that we have, is that seems to be independent to precipitation and temperature. So grassland diversity response to fire doesn't seem to be affected by precipitation levels or temperature. So we can either perform prescribed fires in locations under 400 levels of precipitation or 800, and the response will be the same. In contrast, when we are talking about grassland biomass or productivity, in response to weather parameters, it seems to be more sensible. So it looks like when we are analyzing the response of grasslands productivity to annual precipitation, it seems to be a positive response. So as long as we have more precipitation levels in those locations, it seems that the response in grasslands productivity to fire will be more positive. On the other hand, we have the response of right? That's all right. Okay, so I was saying that it seems that grasslands biomass or productivity seems to be more sensible to weather parameters, and we looked at already that there is a more positive response when we have more precipitation levels in certain locations. In contrast, when we're analyzing grassland productivity correlated with annual temperature, it seems to be a negative response. So in locations that we have more or higher temperature, the response to fire in terms of productivity is negative or trend to be negative. And this is really interesting to see because we can now think about prediction of if we're conducting prescribed fires and we want to improve our productivity grasslands, we may think or consider where are these locations, right? Now, another point that we can analyze with this database is the response of grassland diversity by different plant groups. And what we are seeing here is that it seems that in general, and this is at a global scale, in general, since that grasslands diversity response to fire seems to be more positive for forb communities. And for goody species seems to be reduced as a response to fire. And that makes sense because one of the objectives of conducting fires in grasslands, sometimes when we have issues with a lot of wood encroachment, we use prescribed fires to reduce that. So these results make sense, right? And that's happening at a global scale. So whenever we are conducting prescribed fires, we're reducing in general goody species. And in terms of grasses, the response seems to be a little bit neutral, so neither positive or negative. And what about the response of grasslands productivity by plant groups? It seems to be pretty much similar as with grasslands diversity. So forb seems to be increasing in terms of productivity at a global scale, and goody species seems to be decreasing. Although we don't have a lot of studies to compare here, so there are a limited number of studies that have been conducted and for goody species. And that's a big knowledge gap still here. And again, for grasses, seems to be a neutral response, again, for grasslands productivity at a global scale. Now, one of the main questions we always ask is, how often should we burn? And that's a very important question. And so we divide this database on the studies that conducted fires in different fire intervals. So there are fires that happen on an annual basis, every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years, every 5 years. And what we found here is that it seems that when increasing time between fires seems to improve the response on grassland diversity. So it seems that when we are conducting fires on an annual basis, the response seems to be negative in terms of plant diversity. But as long as we increase in the time between fires, the response seems to be more positive, especially under intervals between 5 years, or a minimum of 5 years. So thinking about ecological restoration here. So if we are trying to improve plant diversity on certain areas in the prairies, what will be the best fire interval? Probably 5 years, right? So those are the things that we can take from this meta-analysis. Now, what about the response of grasslands productivity by burn frequency? And it seems that in general, there is no clear response. Okay, so we can perform prescribed fires on an annual basis or every 4 years, and the response most likely will be the same. Yeah, so I'm just wrapping up here. So what is the role of fire on grasslands productivity and diversity? So in general, it seems that forbs and shrub species display a clear response in terms of productivity and diversity. While forbs increase, shrubs decrease. So that's basically the general idea here. And also, when we're talking about burn frequency, it seems to impact the response of grassland diversity, but not on productivity. And a minimum of 5 years between fires would be more appropriate, thinking about ecological restoration, for example. Also, a very important point here is that climate may play a critical role on grasslands productivity in response to fire. So as we saw in all of these results here, that biomass or productivity in general is highly sensitive to precipitation and temperature. So when we're conducting fires again, we need to take account those parameters before reaching our goals on that particular land. Yeah, I think with that, I'm just finishing here. I just want to acknowledge all the people involved in these projects, helping us collecting all these samples during these 4 or 5 years of work. Really hard work, but really exciting. And also organizations, the Plant Community Ecology Lab, the Canadian Prairies for Sky Fire Exchange, and of course, all the funders of this project. And these are my contact information if you want to reach out, and my Twitter account if you want to follow me as well. And yeah, so thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you, Roy. It was a very interesting talk. Sorry about whatever happened in the middle. We're going to forget about it. Let's start first by giving Roy a huge round of applause.